Like begets like. This simple expression describes how all living things reproduce. When moose have offspring, they have other moose, not ducklings or kittens or bunnies. Seagulls have seagulls. And each species of plants reproduces only the same kind of plant. But offspring also share more specific traits of their parents. A child may have ears and a chin like his mother's, and eyes and a nose like his father's. For thousands of years, people understood that traits are passed down from one generation to the next. But only about 100 years ago did one person begin to understand how this happens. His name was Gregor Mendel. Mendel laid the groundwork for everything we now understand about the patterns of inheritance.
For a long time, many people did not understand that both a mother and father are responsible for the traits of their children. Some thought that children inherited their traits entirely from their fathers. According to one theory, each sperm cell contained a miniature person. When planted in a woman's womb, this tiny being would grow into a full-fledged human. Others thought that the mother alone was responsible for passing traits from one generation to the next. A mother's egg, rather than the father's sperm, contained the future human in miniature. Gradually, people came to understand that a new life is formed only when a father's sperm and a mother's egg combine, and that children inherit characteristics of both their parents.
But how parents pass on traits to their children remained a mystery. Some thought that a child's traits are simply a blend of the same traits in her parents. According to this view, inherited characteristics are like mixing two different colored paints. Just as blue mixed with yellow produces green, the shape of a daughter's nose or the color of her eyes are simply a mix of those same characteristics in her parents. But there were obvious problems with this theory. It didn't explain how a girl might have her mother's blue eyes rather than a blend of her mother's blue eyes and her father's brown eyes. Another mystery was why sometimes a characteristic skips a generation and then reappears. A boy may have his grandmother's red hair, even though his mother didn't inherit it.
Gregor Mendel was the first person to provide answers to questions like these. Mendel was a monk who spent much of his life studying and experimenting with pea plants in the garden of his monastery in what is now the Czech Republic. Pea plants were a good choice for experiments in genetics. For one thing, pea plants can have several distinctly different traits. In some, the stems are tall. In others, they are short. Some have white flowers, while others have purple ones. Some pea plants have yellow seeds or peas. In others, the peas are green. And no matter what their color, the seed can be either wrinkled or round and smooth. These and other distinct features made it easier for Mendel to study how a specific trait is or isn't passed on from one generation of pea plants to the next.
Pea plants were also well suited for Mendel's experiments because of the way they reproduce. In most plants, the pollen of one plant is carried, often by insects, to another plant. Sperm in the pollen then fertilize or fuse with eggs in the receiving plant, and seeds are formed that can grow into new plants. When there are many plants around, however, it is difficult to identify the specific plant that provided the pollen. With many kinds of plants, this makes it hard to trace how hereditary traits are passed down from one generation to the next. But pea plants have a characteristic that helped Mendel overcome this problem. In pea plants, a flower's reproductive parts are completely enclosed by the petals until after fertilization occurs. This means that pollen that develops on a flower's anthers is normally transferred to the tip of the same flower's pistil, which contains the flower's eggs. In other words, a pea plant usually pollinates itself rather than receiving pollen from another pea plant. Over many generations of peas that result from this type of pollination, all the inherited variation can be bred out of a stock of pea plants. Once this has occurred, the plants that result from this pollination, generation after generation, are exactly like the parent plants that produced them. Plants whose offspring are identical to their parents, generation after generation, are called purebred.
When doing his experiments, Mendel would pry open the flower of one purebred plant and remove the pollen-bearing anthers so that the plant couldn't pollinate itself. He would then fertilize it with the pollen of a purebred plant with a different form of the same trait. For example, in some of Mendel's experiments, he pollinated a tall pea plant with pollen from a short one. When a plant receives pollen from a different plant, it is called a cross. Mendel would then collect the peas or seeds that resulted from this cross and plant them. If inheritance involves a blending of traits, the plants that resulted from a cross between a tall plant and a short one should have been somewhere in between tall and short. But they weren't. All the plants were just as tall as the original tall pea plant. The trait of being short disappeared altogether. But Mendel wondered whether this trait had permanently disappeared. So he carried his experiment a step further. He let this generation of pea plants self-pollinate. The eggs in each plant were fertilized by sperm from the same plant. This is like crossing two plants that are exactly alike. The results were surprising. This time, most of the plants were tall, but about 1/4 of the plants were short. The shortness trait that had disappeared with the first generation of plants reappeared in the second.
Based on observations from thousands of such experiments, Mendel reached several conclusions about how heredity works. First of all, he proposed that parents transmit traits to their offspring through what he called factors. For instance, one factor in a pea plant controls its height. Today we call factors genes. Mendel concluded that each factor, or gene, can have different forms. For example, one form of the gene for height is for tall stems. The other form is for short ones. Today, we call the different forms of a gene alleles. An allele is one of two or more different forms of a gene for a specific trait. Mendel also inferred that pea plants have not one but two doses of the gene for each trait, and that they inherit one dose of the gene from each parent. These two copies of the gene can be the same allele, or they can be different alleles. The observation that there are different forms of a gene led Mendel to come up with one of his principles of heredity, the principle of dominance. When an offspring inherits two different forms or alleles of a gene, one allele is dominant and its effect can be seen. The allele whose effect remains hidden is called recessive.
The principle of dominance explains why all the offspring were tall when Mendel pollinated a tall pea plant with two alleles for the tall trait, with pollen from a short plant with two alleles for the short trait. Each of the plants in this next generation inherited one gene for the tall trait and one gene for the short trait. But since the allele for the tall trait is dominant, any plants that resulted from such a cross would be tall. But the recessive allele for shortness didn't disappear. Each plant still had an intact copy of this allele as one of its two doses of the gene. And when these plants pollinated themselves, it was possible for some of the offspring to inherit this recessive allele from both egg and pollen. In this situation, since there is no dominant allele to prevent the recessive allele from expressing itself, the shortness trait reappeared.
Mendel's observations led also to another principle of inheritance, the principle of segregation. According to the principle of segregation, when gametes, or sexual reproductive cells, are formed, the two copies of a given gene in a pair segregate or separate, so that each gamete has only one dose of the gene rather than the normal two. This means that, in humans, for example, a man's sperm gets only a single copy of the gene for each trait. And the same is true for a woman's egg. When a sperm fertilizes an egg, the normal number of 2 doses of each gene is restored. Humans and other living things produce many sperm and egg cells, and which dose of a gene a particular egg or sperm gets when the genes in a pair segregate is purely a matter of chance. It is also a matter of chance which sperm fertilizes which egg, and which combination of alleles results.
When working with pea plants, Mendel was able to apply the laws of probability to patterns of inheritance to calculate the odds that offspring would inherit specific combinations of genes from their parents. Inheriting genes can be compared to flipping a coin. Just as you can't say for sure what genes a person will inherit, you can't with certainty know in advance whether a coin will land heads or tails. But you can say something about the probability of it landing one way or the other. If you toss a coin in the air, the chance that it will land heads up is 50-50, or 1/2. The chance that it will land tails is also 1/2. This doesn't mean that if you toss a coin several times, it will be heads exactly half the time and tails half the time. You might get 4, 5, or even 6 heads in a row. In fact, if you toss a coin only a small number of times, it's unlikely that exactly half the time it will be heads and half tails. But the more times you flip a coin, the closer you get to the ratio of 1 heads for every tails.
Mendel showed that the same laws of probability apply to the inheritance of traits in pea plants. In literally thousands of experiments in which he kept careful records, he demonstrated that if you know the genetic makeup of the parent plants, you can predict the approximate ratios in which certain traits will appear in offspring. For example, in some of his experiments, Mendel crossed plants with 2 alleles for purple flowers with plants with 2 alleles for white flowers. The allele for purple color is dominant to the allele for white color. In the first generation, no offspring had white flowers because each offspring inherited 1 dominant purple allele and 1 recessive white allele. But when Mendel crossed 2 of these offspring, in the second generation, plants with white flowers reappeared in about 1/4 of the cases, which is what Mendel predicted. This happened because about 1/4 of the plants inherited 1 recessive allele for white flower color from each parent.
One way of calculating the probability of certain traits appearing from a cross is to set up what is called a Punnett square. Using a Punnett square, you can see what happens when you cross 2 plants that each have 1 dominant allele for purple flowers and 1 recessive allele for white flowers. According to the principle of segregation, the genes for a specific trait separate when eggs and sperm are produced. Here we show the 2 possible alleles for eggs from one plant along one side of the Punnett square, and the 2 possible alleles for a sperm cell from the other plant along the other side. The Punnett square shows the different possibilities that can occur when an egg and a sperm combine. If an egg with a dominant purple allele combines with a sperm with a dominant purple allele, the plant that results will have 2 doses of the purple allele, and it will have purple flowers. If an egg with a recessive white allele combines with a sperm with a dominant purple allele, the plant will have 1 dominant and 1 recessive allele. Since only the dominant allele is expressed, the plant will have purple flowers. Likewise, if an egg with a dominant purple allele combines with a sperm with a recessive white allele, the plant will have purple flowers. Finally, if an egg with a recessive white allele combines with a sperm with a recessive white allele, the plant will have 2 doses of the recessive white allele, and have white flowers. The 4 squares within the Punnett square each represent the results of a possible gene combination. And each of these possibilities has an equal chance of occurring. So, according to the laws of chance, for every 3 plants with purple flowers, there will be about 1 with white flowers, a ratio of 3 to 1.
Up to now, we've been looking at one trait at a time. For example, tall versus short plants, or plants with white flowers versus plants with purple ones. Crosses between parents that differ in a single trait are called monohybrid crosses. But living things are a combination of many different traits. The puppies in a litter may differ not only in their fur color, for example, but in their size, the shape of their ears, and many other subtle traits. A baby has thousands of identifiable traits that result from different genes, such as the shape of his ears and nose and the texture of his hair. The same is true of pea plants. Mendel did experiments where he crossed plants that differed in 2 characteristics at the same time. A cross that involves 2 different sets of traits is called a dihybrid cross.
In some of his experiments, Mendel started with purebred plants that had round yellow peas. The pair of genes responsible for roundness are represented by the letters capital R, capital R. The pair of genes responsible for yellowness are represented by capital Y, capital Y. Capital letters are often used to designate genes that are dominant. He crossed these plants with purebred plants that had wrinkled green peas. Here we show the genes for wrinkled peas with a small r and the genes for green pea color with a small y. Small letters are usually used to designate genes that are recessive. When these plants are crossed, the next generation of plants inherited from one parent 1 allele for round peas and 1 allele for yellow peas. From the other parent, they inherited 1 allele for wrinkled peas and 1 for green peas. But all the plants that resulted had peas that were yellow and round, because the allele for round, capital R, is dominant to the allele for wrinkled, small r, and the allele for yellow, capital Y, is dominant to the allele for green, small y. Mendel then let these plants pollinate themselves. Some of the plants that resulted were like their parents and grandparents. That is, they had peas that were round and yellow or wrinkled and green. But others had combinations of traits that were unlike any of their parents or grandparents. There were plants with green round peas and others with yellow wrinkled ones. This gave Mendel some important information.
Mendel realized that results like these would not be possible if the genes for round and yellow and the genes for wrinkled and green were somehow linked together. If the genes for different traits were linked, capital R would always be with capital Y, since this was the combination that had existed in the original purebred line. For the same reason, small r would always be with small y. Capital R, capital Y, and small y would then be the only 2 possible combinations of genes that could be in a sperm or egg. A Punnett square shows only 4 different gene combinations that could result when an egg and sperm combine. And these combinations could result in only 2 possible pea types, yellow round and green wrinkled. But if the gene for wrinkled pea shape and the gene for green pea color were not linked, then each of these genes could segregate and sort independently of the other when eggs and sperm are formed. The same would be true for the allele for round pea shape and the allele for yellow color. A Punnett square illustrates how there would be twice as many possible combinations of alleles in both an egg and a sperm. And the offspring that result when egg and sperm combine could have not 2 but 4 different kinds of peas, including the wrinkled yellow and green round peas that Mendel observed. Based on his observations, Mendel came up with his 3rd principle of inheritance, the principle of independent assortment. The principle of independent assortment says that when two traits are studied in the same cross, the genes for one segregate or assort independently of the genes for the other.
Gregor Mendel was years ahead of his time in identifying patterns of heredity and why these patterns occur. He was the first to show that traits are passed down from one generation to the next through genes that occur in pairs, and that offspring inherit one dose of the gene in a pair from each parent.
Working with pea plants, Mendel established three basic principles of heredity. The principle of dominance says that when an offspring inherits two forms or alleles of a gene for a trait, one of the alleles is dominant and its effect can be observed. In pea plants, for example, the allele for long stems is dominant to the allele for short stems. The principle of segregation states that the two doses of the gene controlling a particular trait are separated during the formation of sex cells. For this reason, each egg and sperm cell have only one copy of the gene for each trait rather than the usual two. And finally, Mendel's principle of independent assortment states that the genes for different traits, like round pea shape and yellow pea color, are not linked and can assort independently when sex cells are formed.
Even today, more than 100 years after Mendel's death, these principles form the foundation for our understanding of how heredity works. But we have also learned much more since Mendel. In part 2 of this program, we'll see how Mendel's principles have been modified to take into account other things we have learned about the patterns of inheritance. In part 1 of this program, we saw that Gregor Mendel was the first person to understand how hereditary characteristics are passed on from one generation to the next. Experimenting with pea plants, Mendel showed that hereditary traits are determined by pairs of genes, which he called factors. He also showed that there can be different forms of a gene. For example, the gene for height can have a tall form and a short form. Today, we call these different forms of a gene for a trait alleles. In one of Mendel's experiments, he showed that if a pea plant inherits one tall allele of the gene for height and one short allele, only the tall allele will be expressed. The plant that results will be just as tall as the parent plant from which it got the allele. On the basis of such experiments, Mendel came up with one of his principles of heredity, the principle of dominance. This principle states that when the alleles in a gene pair are different, one allele is dominant and its effect can be seen. The other allele is recessive and isn't expressed. Today, the principle of dominance is still important for understanding patterns of inheritance.
But since Mendel, we have learned that there are often exceptions to the principle of dominance. Another plant, the snapdragon, provides an example. In snapdragons, there are two different alleles for the gene for flower color. When a plant has two alleles for red color, the flowers are red. When a snapdragon has two alleles for white color, the flowers are white. But what happens when you cross these two plants? The offspring would inherit one allele for red color and one allele for white color. According to the principle of dominance, one allele for color should be dominant. If the allele for red is dominant, then all the plants that result from the cross will be red, because they each will have one red allele. Similarly, if the allele for white is dominant, then all the plants will be white. But what in fact happens is that the plants resulting from this cross are neither white nor red. Instead, they are pink.
Snapdragons are an example of incomplete dominance. incomplete dominance occurs when each form of a gene has an effect on the trait that is being expressed. In this example, all the offspring that inherited one allele for red flower color and one allele for white flowers have flowers that are a blend of red and white. The alleles for red flowers and white flowers don't disappear or change, however. Using a Punnett square, you can see what happens if you do a cross between two pink plants. There is a 1 in 4 chance that a plant will inherit 2 red alleles and be red. There is also a 1 in 4 chance that a plant will inherit 2 white alleles and be white. And finally, there is a 2 in 4 chance that a plant will inherit 1 white and 1 red allele and be pink.
There have been other modifications to principles of inheritance formulated by Mendel. Mendel showed that when sperm and egg form, the 2 doses of a gene are separated so that each gamete has only 1 copy of the gene rather than the normal 2. This is called the principle of segregation. When an egg and sperm combine, the normal number of 2 doses of the gene is restored. Since Mendel, scientists have learned that genes exist on structures in cells called chromosomes. Like genes, chromosomes occur in pairs in most cells, including most cells in humans. In fact, each gene of a gene pair lies on a separate chromosome of a particular chromosome pair. What we have learned about chromosomes expands on Mendel's principle of segregation. When gametes are formed, each egg or sperm gets only 1 chromosome of each pair. It is not genes alone that segregate during the formation of sex cells. It is whole chromosomes.
The fact that genes are on chromosomes has caused scientists to modify a 3rd principle of Mendel, the principle of independent assortment. According to the principle of independent assortment, genes for different traits are not linked to each other and assort independently when gametes are formed. For example, if a pea plant has yellow and round peas, the gene responsible for the trait of being round, shown here with a capital R, isn't linked to the gene responsible for the trait of being yellow, shown with a capital Y. Because these genes are not linked, they can assort independently of each other when gametes are formed. In any organism, however, there are many more genes than there are chromosomes. Humans, for example, have hundreds of thousands of genes, but only 23 pairs of chromosomes. Obviously, on each chromosome, there are many genes. They are chained together in a way by the chromosome on which they lie, although this linkage isn't absolute and can, in certain cases, be broken. This means that while chromosomes assort independently during the formation of sex cells, the genes that exist together on a single chromosome usually assort together. So we have to modify Mendel's principle of independent assortment. Genes assort independently when sex cells are formed if they are on different pairs of chromosomes.
Our understanding of genetics has changed in still other ways since Mendel experimented with pea plants. Mendel believed that each pair of genes affects only a single trait. One pair might determine whether the flowers of a pea plant are white or purple, for example. However, we now know of cases in which a single gene affects several traits. In the fruit fly Drosophila, for example, a single gene affects eye color, wing size, body hairs, and other characteristics. The capacity of a single gene to affect several traits is called pleiotropy.
Mendel also thought that each trait was controlled by a single gene. Mendel's pea plants did, in fact, have either tall stems or short ones because of a single gene. However, we now know that often a particular trait is affected by many genes. For example, geneticists believe that most human traits, such as skin color, are determined by more than one gene. When a trait is affected by many genes, it is called polygenic inheritance. A person's final height is another example. Unlike a pea plant, a person's height is influenced by a number of different genes that affect things like hormone production, bone formation, and metabolism. Traits controlled by more than one pair of genes usually show continuous variation. Unlike pea plants, which are either tall or short, people show a wide range of heights because there are many different genes that affect how they grow. We also know now that the environment can affect how genes are expressed. For example, a person's genes may predispose him to be tall, but how a person grows is also affected by his diet. In many instances, genes and environment both affect how different traits are expressed, and it is usually difficult or impossible to know the extent of the influence of each.
There is still much to learn about how inheritance works, but scientists have made great strides in unlocking the nature of specific genes and how they function. Among other projects, researchers are now trying to identify all the different genes that lie on human chromosomes and what they do. Many think this research will have greater consequences than our exploration of outer space or any other scientific endeavor. For in the not-too-distant future, it may lead to much greater understanding of what it is to be human. But the groundwork of all our understanding of genetics was laid by one man, Gregor Mendel, who worked alone with pea plants in the garden of his monastery.